of our ongoing series of the study of the Bible. We both hope you are well, and more than that, we hope you are coping with the Florida weather. At least here, it's really, really rainy. It's very English. It's kind of nice in a way. When I walked the dog this morning, he wasn't very pleased, but I was like, oh, this is okay. If it only was like 30 degrees lower, it would have been perfect. Because it's pretty bad.
We don't have any people on yet.
We don't, do we?
Oh, now there's one.
Oh, there's two all of a sudden. I
Two.
pointed and two. Wow, this finger's dangerous.
Yes, yes it is.
Well, good morning. As you come on, if you would say hi to us, that would be great. And we'll try and keep saying that as people come on. But before we begin, we have a clarification from last week so that...
But do we know if Jeannie is online
well,
yet?
you can watch it afterwards.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
All right.
it can always go back to the beginning. Good morning, Karen. And Karen can tell her as well. Giving Karen a job to do.
Yeah.
Right, regarding Jeannie's question last week,
Yes.
which was a good one.
There is a theory about the compilation of the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And the theory is that there were various traditions that were ultimately stitched together to form Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, however, is a complete done by a scribe called the
Deuteronomist.
The Deuteronomist.
Yeah.
And but there are, you can identify strains of the tradition in the first 2 chapters of Genesis actually have 2 different creation stories. One, which is thought to be the older, is the story of Adam and Eve, which begins in the 2nd chapter, and that is a Yahwist.
Are you sure it's not the priestly?
Yes, I am. There are 4. The 4 strains are Yahwist, which uses the word
letter J.
The Tetragrammaton, Yahweh. The Elohist, which uses the word Elohim, the priestly, and then the Deuteronomical. Deuteronomic.
Ist.
Deuteronomic.
I can't say it. Deuteronomist.
Yeah, you can't say it either, can you? Uh-huh.
On the big screen, you poor people. For next week, we'll try and do it in 4K. That will horrify you.
Yeah, with surround sound.
And hello, Anne. Good morning to you as well. Hiya.
So the 2nd chapter of Genesis is the Yahwist version, and the 1st chapter is the priestly version. And the priestly version is thought to be much newer than the old creation story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And it's thought that the priestly prologue, that 1st chapter, was an attempt to correct misinformation or heterodoxy, things that were not actually orthodox, that were being believed about creation. So in those first 2 chapters, it has to do with the name, the way the name of God is used. In the 1st chapter, the name that is used is Elohim, which means the Lord.
Lord God.
But in the 2nd chapter, they use Yahweh Elohim, Lord God.
That's the Lord God. It's really confusing.
Yeah,
and that clarification's not helped at all.
No, I mean, it's very confusing.
It's better when you see it written down. So what we'll probably do for next week is have a written down version of it. So it'll just have it in 2 columns. Because it is actually a lot deeper and broader than that as well. Because this has been around for quite a while. This notion of
the literary
priestly
strands.
and Yahwehist and this and that. But it's come under a lot of contention in recent years because of new discoveries. So it's not as widely accepted as when Father Lewis studied theology compared with when I studied theology.
Although the general concept of varying traditions being
Yeah.
knitted together
It's just seen in a different light now than what it used to be.
Still.
So you're welcome to that clarification.
Which was clear as mud.
Oh dear. Anyway,
I thought you were going to make the sign of the cross there.
I'm just going to burn you. Last week we began looking at the history behind the flood story that we find in Genesis chapters 6 through 9. And we heard about many of the stories that exist across the world and throughout world history regarding a flood. And we recounted 2 such flood stories, both of them from North America. Wow.
Excuse me.
You have a growling tummy.
Yes.
We ended last week by telling you we were going back to look at a certain story that had a large influence on what we read about in the flood in Genesis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is it's kind of fun, really. But we're going to continue with looking at our list of literary types. And just to remind you, we were mentioning these literary types to show you how nuanced scripture can be, as it involves many forms that we might otherwise miss, especially if you're going to look at something and you just take it at face value. I don't mean literally. I just mean you don't see what kind of text it is, what type
what kind of device the author's using.
So we're beginning where we left off, and so we're at P, and the first one is pastoral. Now this literary form, it uses the idyllic imagery of rural poetry or shepherds in a lovely rustic setting to portray a feeling or a truth. And one of the best examples of this is Psalm 23, which takes the reader through a day in the life of a shepherd who cares for his sheep from morning to night. And the psalmist uses these images to express God's gracious care for his people. Jesus carries this and takes this a step further in his allegory of the Good Shepherd, which we find in John's Gospel. The prophets also have made effective use of pastoral settings to depict the blessings of God's kingdom. And for example, Isaiah, Hosea, and Amos have these. I suppose Isaiah would be the easiest to remember and recall. The Song of Solomon describes the experience of love by praising the beauty and virtue of the beloved through natural and rustic images. And that's in chapters 2 and 7, for instance. So, where is page 2? Somebody's been playing with them. There it is.
Oh, Lordy, there it is.
How did you do that?
I don't know.
Are you a card shark?
Yes, I am.
Do you play poker and cheat?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right.
The next literary device is personification. And personification is a figure of speech which takes a human characteristic and amplifies it and applies it to an object, a quality, or an idea. For example, in Matthew's Gospel, therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Tomorrow is an abstract idea of time, and yet we're ascribing to it the human ability to ruminate, I guess not ruminate, but think about what is coming forward, to be anxious about what's coming forward.
As if you can place it in a pot called tomorrow, and then it'll be there. Yeah, we move on to one of my favorites, just because of the word itself, pleonasm. It sounds to me like a scientific theory gone wrong and be on some kind of horror.
But it is your literary type.
It is. Yes. I wonder why he's saying this. This is the definition of pleonasm. It is a figure that uses an excessive number of words for the sake of emphasis. Who
Like
uses
repetitiously redundant.
So if, for example, you hear this all the time in the Gospels, but here's a particular one of them. And it came to pass in those days. The emphasis, and it came to pass, is common in both the Old and New Testaments. And it's kind of, doesn't really matter. If you just said, in those days, this happened.
Once upon a
Yeah.
time.
Then you don't need, and it came to pass in a kind of august tones. Although I suppose it would be bad if you did it in a kind of Shakespearean voice with a deep, and it came to pass. And that'd be a bit.
Or you did it for 37 minutes and 37 seconds. Yes.
46 minutes? Here we go.
No. Not 46 minutes.
Josh, you are my inspiration.
Yeah. Josh, you're fired. The next literary device that we're going to talk about is poetry. And we all have kind of studied poetry in high school or college, but more of the Bible is written in poetry than most people can imagine. And part of the reason we don't see it, or we don't see it as poetry, is the actual layout on the page. When Bibles are printed, sometimes they condense poetic form, the literary form on the page, into kind of a prose dialogue just to save paper.
Plus, there's the translation problem as well.
Yeah.
What we see as poetry doesn't come out as poetry when it changes from one language to another.
No, so in addition to the books of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and the Song of Solomon, a substantial portion of the prophetic literature, including most of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Micah, and Nahum, and Zephaniah, this literature is also poetic. Almost half of the Old Testament is poetry. But in many translations, some of this poetry appears in a prose form.
Yeah, which is, as we said, it's kind of sad, really.
Yeah. The poetry of the Bible is an effective vehicle for communicating the full range of human emotions, from the height of joy to the depths of despair, in a very personal way. The poet and the prophets express their sorrows, the plight of their people, and their unshakable hope in the Lord. There are, however, different types of poetry.
And we're going to be looking at those. I just want to mention that sometimes because of space and wanting to make a font size that's legible, when we have the Sunday bulletin, I change what would be a poetic form that's kind of written out as in a shape of a poem, and I remove all the lines. Otherwise, it'd be in like 2-point, or the bulletin would be 15 pages long just to get it all in, which is, again, kind of sad. So when you get when you look at the Sunday readings, if you go to the website, liturgypage.org, is it? I think there's a link in the page 2 of the anchor at the bottom.
Lectionary page.
Lectionary page.
.org.
Thing. Yeah, lectionarypage.org. You'll see how it's laid out, and quite often it is in poetic form. So let's look at another form of poetry, and this is called parallelism. And parallelism in Hebrew poetry, while many forms of poetry make use of rhyming and the sounds of rhyming, Hebrew poetry uses the rhyming of ideas. Since the rhythm is logical, kind of Mr. Spock.
Yeah.
So this is Vulcan rather than human, with a phonetic sounds like one day I went to the park. I should have gone in the day instead of the dark. You know, that kind of park dark thing. Much of it is retained in translation because it's to do with ideas. In most verses, the thought of the second line is parallel to the thought of the first line. Some verses are made of 3, 4, even 5 lines, and the parallelism is extended throughout.
Another type of poetic device is synonymous parallelism. In this form of parallelism, the thought of the first line is repeated in different words in the next couple of lines. Lord, how they have increased who trouble me. Many are they who rise up against me.
So you're basically saying the same thing twice.
Yeah. And that's Psalm 3, and it's the first verse. See also Genesis 4, 23, 24, Psalm 49, first verse, Psalm 103, the third verse, Proverbs 11, 7 and 25, and then Proverbs 12, 28.
So we move to the next form of poetry within parallelism, and that's antithetical parallelism. In this case, the thought of the first line is sharply contrasted with the next line or lines. So in case the Proverbs, this is one you'll have heard. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So you've got soft answer, soft word, but then you get the opposite of that. And you find it in one of the Psalms and in a bunch of Proverbs as well.
The next type of parallelism is synthetic parallelism. Here, the first line is added to or developed by the next lines. And this is from the first Psalm. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. So you see that the blessed man is given three attributes. He does not walk in the counsel of the ungodly. The blessed man does not stand in the path of sinners, nor does the righteous man sit in the seat of the scornful.
We'll then turn to introverted parallelism. Now, this isn't a shy form of parallelism that doesn't speak to you and never likes going to parties.
The wallflower.
The wallflower of all parallelisms. This is an external parallelism that balances a set of lines. For example, the first and the fourth lines and the second and the third lines may be parallel, as in Proverbs 23, 15, 16, and Psalm 30, verses 8 through 10. And I should have written these examples down, but I didn't do. Lines 1 and 2 are parallel to lines 7 and 8. So you're looking for like little groupings and then seeing how they're compared and contrasted within the verses themselves.
The next parallelism is called climactic parallelism. And this uses parallelism to build to a climax by repeating part of the first line and adding to it in the next lines. And here's an example from Psalm 29. Give unto the Lord, O ye mighty ones. Give unto the Lord glory and strength. Give unto the Lord the glory due his name. And you see that each line repeats that idea of give unto the Lord and adds a new and deeper meaning.
Which moves us to emblematic parallelism. Here, a literal statement in one line is elevated by a figurative image in another. So from Proverbs 25:25, as cold water to a weary soul, so is good news from a far country. It's one of those things where the idea it isn't necessarily framed in a similar way. So we've got cold water and good news. Well, there's nothing really to link those two. It's the attribute that's not attribute. It's the place it's put in. Cold water to a weary soul. It refreshes. So it's good news from a far country. It makes me happy. It's good news.
So in addition to these forms of parallelism, there are also incomplete forms which have only partial correspondence. Another technique in some Hebrew poetry is the use of acrostics or alphabetical poems. In this poetry, the first line or set of lines begins with the first letter of the alphabet, and then the poem proceeds in this way to the end of the alphabet. Now, examples include Psalm 9, 10, 25, 34, 111, 112, 119, 145, and then in Proverbs 31 and Lamentations chapters 1 through 4.
Now, that's said this is in the original language.
Yeah, you're not going to see it
a
in
few
English.
weeks ago, like week 1 and week 2, when we looked at so-called Bible code. It could be that some people got an idea of this acrostics thing going on, but then, made it something it's not. And it's also not a big thing. It's just a style. It's
a technique.
A technique. And while there is some meter in biblical poetry, so that it would be in the same form that we're used to having, I wandered lonely as a cloud and all that lot. It's not a major characteristic. When meter is used, it appears in the form of varying combinations of stressed units per line. This meter in turn is interlaced with different kinds of parallelism. And the stressed units and parts of the parallelism cannot be discerned without the Hebrew text. So unless you have a good grounding in Hebrew, I don't, and have a British English text next to you. Well, God is British, so.
Well, yeah, he uses the prayer book.
Yes, he does. You're not going to catch it. You're not going to see those things. And even with the Hebrew, the divisions between the stanzas or stanzas and trophes is sometimes unclear, since the thought breaks are not always uniform in length. Another thing, we tend to like, even in our music, we like certain patterns to continue throughout. So when we come across, say, modern poetry, which doesn't seem to conform to anything, but you have to see how it's actually laid out, because it'll be something, then one word on its own. And the modern poet, has done that on purpose to highlight the word or make you stress it in a different way. And that's about as near as the English comes to this form of Hebrew style of poetry.
Another type of poetry is narrative or dramatic poetry. The book of Job is an excellent example of narrative poetry in that it portrays a dramatic story. The plot moves from prosperity to calamity to the restoration of prosperity. There are a number of plot conflicts, including Satan's conflict with God and Jacob, Job, the conflict between Job and his friends, and the conflict between Job and God. The prologue, chapters 1 and 2, and the epilogue, chapter 42, are written in prose, but the rest of the book is in the form of a poetic dialogue. The action moves slowly in the poetic section, and the reader is expected to concentrate more on the development of the imagery and the concepts than on the sequence of events. Within this great poetic narrative, there are many lyric passages. It also is part of wisdom literature of the Old Testament because of the themes it explores, including the goodness and sovereignty of God in view of the problem of evil and suffering.
When I was at college, I did a course on the book of Job, and the lecturer was a bit of a character. The lecture started when he opened his can of ginger beer, non-alcoholic, and the lecture ended when he'd taken the last swig. Now, he'd done this for many years, so I'm sure that his lectures formed a shape. Well, I'm not only sure they
Here,
did.
drink.
Yeah, it's not like he was thirsty, so you'd have like a 3-minute lecture. They followed a pattern, and the pattern they followed was this poetic dynamic within the book. Because I, for one, I'd read the book of Job, and the only thing I knew was the book of Job is about human suffering. And when I read it, I'm thinking, well, that doesn't answer the problem of human suffering at all. It kind of makes it worse. Of course, I misunderstood that it's wisdom literature. It's not there to convey the truth of how God answers human suffering. It's to convey the truth about the reality of human suffering, which in itself, within some religions, is not believed to be a real thing. And even within Christianity, there are some versions of Christianity which diminish people's suffering. They either say it's not real, it's in your head, or it's because
It's
you're
your
a miserable
fault.
sinner. You don't have enough faith, both of which are really bad and not Christian. And the other thing is to do with God's overarching sovereignty over everything. And when I kind of learned that, apart from becoming a fan of ginger beer by the end of the course, I thought it was a really good, it was a worthwhile thing that I took that. So let's move on to our next slide, which is lyric poetry. Lyric poetry is predominantly in the book of Psalms, which you think would make sense, really, wouldn't you? Because it's the songs of
Psalms
the
are
ancient
hymn
church.
book.
And the Song of Solomon. That's a more difficult one, because when you read the Song of Solomon, it doesn't seem to. It has a lyrical quality, but not in a poetic sense, not to my ears anyway. The Psalms speak to the mind through the heart, which is, I think, the best music does that. It bypasses the intellect in a way and just gets you. But since the Psalms were set to music, their emotional effect was even greater when they were sung as part of Israel's worship in the first and second temples. One of the things I've never understood are these denominations which shun all singing and the playing of instruments because they're the tools of the devil. And yet we have, you know,
We even have dancing in the Psalms.
we have all this, and we lose out because God's given us all these tools. You know, these things are rich in artistry and the artistry of parallelism, how they speak to us. They present before us figurative imagery. They give us symbols which express things we don't have the language to express. They also give us multiple meanings. So Father Lewis and I can look at the same thing and come up with different notions. And I don't know about you, but I know of many songs that are popular songs, and when somebody's asked the writer, well, why did you write this? And they say, oh, this, and this. And you'd be like, what? I always understood it to mean this, because we come at it with our own context. And they also employ emotive language and vocabulary, which can hit us in a different way. Now, each of the Psalms is a brief literary unit that develops a theme and makes a distinctive contribution to the whole of the Psalter. They can be really, really short, or they can be really, really long. And I'm looking at you, Psalm 119.
Yeah.
It used to be that I hated the Psalms. I really did. I just thought it was boring as anything. But over the years, and because of my parish priest boss in my first parish, I've really learned to love them. The Psalms are structured in different ways and can be classified into several different types, including individual and communal lament psalms, where the whole people, the whole temple will be mourning something, or the whole people of Israel. There's also communal and individual thanksgiving psalms. There's descriptive praise psalms. There are wisdom psalms. There are different types of psalms that have had specific functions within the individual and corporate worship of Israel. And having said that, here ends the literary forms for this week.
Thanks be to God.
Well, we do know that we're bringing before you some really, really subtle differences. Unless you slow down your Bible reading and really pay attention, you're not going to catch most of them. And it takes practice, like with most things. But added together, they really do make a difference in not only how we read our Bible, but in the sense that we get out of the Bible, which is why they are important.
And I just now thought about giving a link to one of the Psalms being sung in Hebrew by an Israeli folk group, and they sing it to a traditional psalm. I mean, it's a traditional psalm setting for them, and
Do you remember the name of the group?
I think it's called Yanni, but we'll post the link. He'll post the link. I'll give him the link and he'll post it. Because if I post it, there's no telling where you'll end up.
You'll blow up the internet.
Yes.
So now we're going to move on to the meat of today's study. And we've got 30 minutes, so we're doing pretty well. We're going to take a close look at the Epic of Gilgamesh. And as always, we will begin at looking at its context.
Now, the first thing to know is that there probably will be questions. And if you have a question, please write it, convey it to us and we'll try to answer. Because
people asking questions. You're
yes.
not going to be asking.
No, I'm not going to be. There's no test this
all right.
week.
Okay.
Next week, but not this week.
If you have any questions, post them. We may not be able to answer them this week because of lack of time. Although it doesn't really matter. We probably could.
Yeah.
But if something pops into your head midweek, just send it to us and we'll try and answer it next week.
Scholars who study cuneiform and Assyrian literature have three distinct editions of this story of Gilgamesh. There's a Sumerian story, which is called the Eridu Genesis, and it was discovered in 1917, so over 100 years ago. Then there's an Assyrian version called the Epic of Atrahasis, and this was only discovered in 1972. And then there's the Babylonian, the Gilgamesh epic, which was discovered in 1872. And the person who first read and kind of deciphered the Gilgamesh epic was a scholar by the name of George Smith. And he was a scholar at the British Museum, and he was the first person to read the clay tablet with the Gilgamesh epic inscribed on it. He was so startled by the similarities with the Genesis story of the flood, it is reported by contemporary scholars that were in the room when he was reading this, that he began to pull at his hair, he began to run around in the room, and he began to take off his clothes. Clearly, he was upset. The Gilgamesh epic was collated by a scribe named
This is a good one.
Senleki Uni.
Something like
My Assyrian is not real good.
Mine's 0.
And this was in the middle of the Babylonian period, 1600 to 1100 BC, somewhere in that area.
So we're talking a good few thousand years ago.
Yeah. It is believed by scholars that the Genesis story of the flood was collected during the Babylonian captivity of the kingdom of Judah, which was around 597 BC to 537 BC.
So 1,000 years after
Yeah.
the collation.
So the Babylonian captivity began after the Judean kingdom aligned itself with the Egyptians in a battle at Carchemish. And the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar the second, conquered Jerusalem. He won the battle of Carchemish, and then he conquered Jerusalem in the 4th year of his reign and demanded tribute from King Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim paid tribute to Nebuchadnezzar for 3 years, but then for some reason he stopped paying tribute and started sending it to Egypt. In the 7th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Jerusalem was again besieged, and Jehoiakim was killed, and his successor, Jeconiah, and his court were taken into Babylonian exile. I have to tell you the story. When I was in seminary, I was a sacristan, which meant I kind of looked after the worship services in the chapel. And this was during the summer, and we were having a celebration of the Eucharist. And the person who was supposed to read did not show up. So I ended up having to read the Old Testament lesson. And I started reading, and I thought, oh my goodness, I'm reading the Jerusalem phone directory. Because there was name after name after name, and I was mispronouncing them all over the place. The celebrant was the Old Testament professor, and he started to laugh. And I kind of started to chuckle too. And so I ended the list of names by just saying, and all of the others. I just had to get out of all the Hebrew names.
So if you are a lecturer at some point and this happens to you, just mention one or two and then say, and the rest.
Yeah, and God knows who they are. So, in the 7th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, he takes Jeconiah and his court to Babylon. So another siege of Jerusalem happens in Nebuchadnezzar's 18th year. And King Zedekiah, who was the successor of Jeconiah, was deported along with his court to Babylon. Now, this is the king whose sons were killed, and they made him watch them being executed. And then Zedekiah was blinded and was taken in bondage to Babylon. So the last thing that Zedekiah saw was the death of his children. It's kind of a chilling...
It's awful, isn't it?
Yeah, chilling thing. The fourth and final deportation occurred in Nebuchadnezzar's 23rd year. And this period of Judean exile in Babylon began in 597 BC, and it ended with the fall of the Babylonian Empire to the Persian king Cyrus the Great in 539 BC. Cyrus permitted the exiled Judeans to return to Judah, and the construction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem was begun in 537.
Now, if you listened closely, you'll have heard the dates there is that the fall of the Babylonian Empire to Persian king Cyrus the Great in 539 BC. That matches up pretty nicely with the time when it's believed scholars think the Genesis story of the flood was collected and brought into the Jewish faith during the Babylonian captivity. So it all ties in nicely together. But what I'm going to do now is going to give you the potted story, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The book itself is quite thick, and there's a lot to it. And we find the flood story in tablet 9 of the Epic. Now, the tablets, we tried to get a photograph of one of them, a picture that had one in the person's hand.
It's a little bit bigger than that.
Yeah, they're tiny. And to be able to read it is, but there weren't any pictures big enough that didn't sort of pixelate to the point of being, unintelligible.
Yeah.
So we're going to introduce the characters of the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's Gilgamesh himself. He is the hero. He is a Sumerian hero who's traveled the world in search of a way to cheat death. And it's during one of his journeys that he comes across an old man whose name is Utnapishtim, who tells Gilgamesh a story from centuries past. The gods brought a flood that swallowed the earth. So the next character to be talked about is Utnapishtim. And this character is the one who builds the ark and gathers his family and the animals. So this is his story. There's, how do you pronounce it? Ea?
Yeah.
Ea is the Akkadian counterpart of Enki, who was the god of ritual purification. Ritual cleansing waters were called Ea's water. Ea governed the arts of sorcery and incantation, and in some stories he is also the form-giving god and thus the patron of craftsmen and artists. He was also known as the bearer of culture, which then introduces us to Enki. Enki is the Sumerian god of water. And so those are the main characters. So here's the Pishtim story of Gilgamesh in a nutshell. The gods were very angry at mankind, so they sent a flood to destroy them. Why were the gods angry with mankind? Well, because
humans were making too much noise and the gods couldn't sleep.
We've all been there, haven't we? Wow. This is the basis of the epic. Thus the god Ea warned Pishtim in a dream, instructing him to build an enormous boat to save himself, his family, and the seed of all living things. And he does as he's told. And the gods brought rain which caused the water to rise for 6 days and 6 nights.
And when the rain subsided, the boat landed on a mountain, upon which Utnapishtim set loose first a dove, then a swallow, and finally a raven, which found land. The god Ishtar, the goddess of rain and thunderstorms, then created a rainbow and placed it in the sky as a reminder to the gods and as a pledge to mankind that there would never be another flood. Even though we have not yet read the Genesis flood story, we're going to do a little bit of a comparison of the flood story in Genesis with the Epic of Gilgamesh and see how similar they are.
Now, first, apologies for the quality of these next slides, because we were at a pinch to get them out, and word being word, it underlines certain lines just because they're tabulated and they're not connected what word thinks is to the rest of the text. So There you go.
So the first similarity is the extent of the flood. In Genesis, it's a global event.
Claims to be global.
Yes.
It uses the word global.
Global. And Gilgamesh also claims to be a global event. Now, the cause for the flood was, in Genesis, man's wickedness. In Gilgamesh, it was man's sins.
And noise-making ability.
And noise-making ability. And this was intended for whom? The flood was intended for whom? In Genesis, it's all mankind. In Gilgamesh, and this I didn't understand, but it's one city and then kind of all of mankind after that.
Yeah, we're going to get one city, but oops.
Yeah, sorry about that. And then the sender of the flood in Genesis is Yahweh, and in Gilgamesh, it's an assembly of gods. The hero's name is Noah in Genesis, and in Gilgamesh, it's Utnapishtim. And the hero's character, what he's seen to be as a character, he is righteous in both the Genesis and the Gilgamesh epic. And the means of announcement are a little bit different. In Genesis, Noah hears directly from God, and in Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim receives a dream.
Limbin, limbin, olai, biscuit barrel, fatang, fatang.
And he's ordered to build a boat in both stories. And did the hero complain? Yes, in both stories, Noah and Utnapishtim had something to say back to the gods. The height of the boat was several stories, 3 in Genesis, and 6 in the Gilgamesh epic. It had interior compartments, many. It had one door. It had at least one window
to let the birds. An opening, I guess.
Yeah, to let the birds out. The exterior coating of the ark in both stories was pitch, and the shape of the ark was rectangular in Genesis and square in Gilgamesh.
Although that is being kind of questioned now with one particular person whose name
He's an
is
Assyriologist, Finkel,
Finkel,
Irving,
something like that.
Irving Finkel at the
Also
British
the British
Museum.
Yeah.
Now the human passengers in the ark, besides the Noah and
Utnapishtim.
I have to see the word in order to say it. Utnapishtim. In Genesis, it's only family members.
8 in total, isn't it?
Yes, 8. And then in the Gilgamesh epic, it's family and a few others. And it's interesting when I was reading through this that Utnapishtim included a navigator, and that was one of the other non-family members. The means of the flood were groundwater and heavy rain in Genesis,
which we will explain more about. It's kind of as a hint, it's kind of a reversal of the creation story, when God separated the waters above the earth and those under the earth.
And now they're
he's
coming
bringing
together.
back together again.
Then the duration of the flood.
Oh, did you mention?
In Gilgamesh, it's just heavy rain. It
happened in England.
The duration of the flood in Genesis, it's a long flood. It's 40 days and 40 nights plus however many days they were floating on the water. And in Gilgamesh, it was short. It was 6 days and 6 nights. And the test to find land was the release of birds in both stories. And the type of birds in Genesis was a raven and 3 doves. And in Gilgamesh, it was a dove, a swallow, and then a raven. The ark landed on a mountain, and then there was a divine pledge that the flood would never take place again, and that pledge was the rainbow. And that occurs in both stories. After leaving the ark, there is a sacrifice, first by Noah in Genesis, and then by Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh epic. And both heroes are blessed after the flood. Noah is blessed with many, many descendants, and Utnapishtim is blessed with immortality. And just for some background information, Noah means or signifies rest in Hebrew, and Utnapishtim is a way of saying finder of life. Although we have told this story in an uncomplicated a fashion as possible, one of the major complications for the experts is that the flood story existed in several cultures and was adapted by successive later cultures, varying names and places as time passed. At the present, scholars have discovered those 3 distinct forms of the flood story, excluding the Bible story: the Sumerian, the Assyrian, and the Babylonian.
So the question we can ask ourselves is, what do we learn from this, and what do we need to know? Well, we consider what we've heard, or when we consider what we've heard, a reaction may well be like that of the British Museum scholar who deciphered the Gilgamesh epic. I wouldn't expect you all to run around pulling your hair out and
taking off your clothes.
No. Leave that for another day, and one where it's not as wet. He may well have felt that the authority and the authenticity of the Bible was being undermined by this earlier story. But we have to learn that the Bible wasn't written in a vacuum, and that, like all other types of history, its writers were influenced by cultures outside of their own. we also have to understand that divine inspiration is not dependent on our understanding of historical accuracy. One of the things that kind of bugs me about a lot of the YouTube videos I watch that are produced by atheists is that they impose 21st century standards of literature
And historicity.
and historicity onto ancient cultures that didn't have that, and also impose scientific views and knowledge in the same way. They do it on the most simple of things, and it just shouldn't be done. It's just a bad way of working.
And I think one of the things that we do when we read stories like this in the Bible, modern readers get hung up on the details.
Yeah.
And the biblical listener, reader, would probably have focused on why this story was written. That God, that the wages of sin is some consequence. And that God, even though he might have judgment, ultimately is merciful and restores goodness.
And modern Christians get hung up on all this as well, where they'll take it literally to the point that somebody will build the ark as if it's saying something.
Is that in Kentucky or?
Oh, I don't know.
Or Tennessee?
I've seen it, and people can go and visit it. You have to say,
it's called the Ark Experience.
Yes. What is the point?
And you have to pay $25 to get in.
I'm not. But yeah, but it kind of misses the point completely anyway. What's the story behind it? What is the truth that's being said? Even if it were physically, ultimately provable to be a true story, and geologists suddenly discovered that actually there was a universal flood, the truth of the story is something else. It's to do with God. Well,
with God.
Yeah, we're getting ahead of ourselves, and I don't want to do that. That would be spoiler alert city. So that's where we're going to end. Actually, we've done pretty well. We've got 8 minutes left. Wow, we're getting good at this.
Any questions?
Do you have any questions? And do you want anything to be clarified? I know some of it was... One of the things for me is it being on video, and you can you can bring it up on your screen anytime you want. And you can go over the things that were as clear as mud to you. If that's the whole hour, then please let us know. We'll try and do better next time. But it is one we are approaching. Remember, the point of this is not only the study of the Bible, but is to approach difficult texts. And this is a difficult text for a lot of people, because it's that, how can this be true? And all the evidence against it. So it's got to be rubbish. And if this is rubbish, why can we trust any of the rest of the Bible? Because the rest of the Bible must be rubbish.
I think just to remember or think back to last week, we talked about the natural events that might have influenced the remembrance of a flood. There was a catastrophic flood in the Euphrates Valley in 2800 BC that wiped out several cities. There is also the theory that as the last glacier started to retreat and melt,
last ice age.
Yeah, the last ice age, as it melted, it started to raise the sea level, and so coastal areas were being inundated by seawater. So there are some scientific theories about what might be the origin of this universal flood story. And there's also I think the American Indian stories that we heard last week. They were from the Southwest, and in the Southwest, flash floods are very, very common. And you can almost imagine these people remembering some catastrophic flash flood that wiped out, villages and people.
One of the complaints, because this is how it sounded, of one of the atheist YouTubers discussing the flood was that all the stories he'd looked at all seemed to originate from coastal areas.
Duh!
Exactly. If you were living in a coastal area and you suddenly have a flood, Well, just ask the people who've suffered from Ida, and God bless them
Yeah.
in what's happening there. Please do keep the people in
In
Louisiana and
prayer.
all the other areas who've suffered from Ida. And is it still around? Is it still actively
It's
wreaking havoc?
traveled up.
Traveling north.
Yeah, it's a tropical.
Boy.
It's not even a tropical storm now, but a lot of rain.
And imagine we have the technology to have a week's notice, a few days' notice in these things. Imagine when they just appear.
Yeah.
What it must be like when you've had absolutely zero prep time. It's you know it's got to be frightening. It's frightening watching the things. That poor guy who got killed by an alligator when he was just on his street in the water because the alligators have suddenly, wow.
Oh, I didn't hear about that one.
No, yeah, frightening. So we still have 5 minutes left if you would like to ask questions or have something in mind or just want to pass the time of day and say hi.
Hello.
Can't do that tune because otherwise it's copyright. No, it's copyright.
Oh, copyright.
We don't have the copyright.
Yeah,
for
we'll
that.
be.
Yeah, the whole video will be blocked.
Yeah.
We cannot allow that to happen. I'm not going through this again. No, it's good. I'm enjoying it. It's stuff I did years and years and years and years and years ago, and coming back to it and seeing how things have changed in terms of what we know. Hi, Vern, and good morning.
Did you know
Did I know?
Pishtim personally? Is that what you mean by many years ago?
Well, I thought the same with you when you mentioned the Egyptian flooding of the flooding of the Nile in Egypt, and I thought, well, you were there, you'd know.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are ongoing discoveries all the time. It's just fascinating, and I don't know. It's these people who dedicate their life just to what seems such an obscure thing like learning cuneiform, a dead language.
That language to me is very interesting. I'm not going to study it, but just the writing of it is very, very interesting. It's done with a triangular stylus. The stylus is long, but the shape of the stylus is a triangle, and they use the point. They use the end of the stylus to make all these different shapes that make up words and letters.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And we have all these archaeologists that go into the heat and and even the cold to make discoveries and to improve humanity's knowledge of itself. So great stuff, and to have people like that, who are willing to study kind of obscure things I think it's amazing. Ann Abbott, for your information, Gilgamesh text is available electronically through Tampa Bay Library in English. Yes. Yes, it is. You can buy different versions of the book in English on Amazon as well. It is interesting, but you'll keep stopping and wondering where it's coming from. So you need to have. But yeah, at least from the Tampa Library, it's free. So we like free.
Gilgamesh is a very long and complicated story.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just the flood story.
Bill says, good show, but please, no pleonasm in church. I think that ship has already sailed. At least with me as preacher.
Oh, please. Let's bring
46 minutes.
Let's bring the ship back to shore.
But the ark is still in the waters, being tossed by the pleonasmic seas. Pleonasmic seas.
Oh dear.
Of my tongue.
Oh, here we go. Here we go.
I could wax lyrical, but I don't have enough time. Of course I do. Let me start.
When did that ever stop you?
Yes. So now I'm caffeinated. I could really go.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for spending your time with us. We do appreciate it. We do hope you've gotten something out of it. And so next week we will begin looking at the text. It's only taken us a lot of pleonasm to get here, but we've created the context, we've built the foundation. We will now build upon that with the actual text of Genesis and the flood, chapters 6 through 9. So bring your Bible. We might even use them next week. So take care. Please keep us in your prayers. Please keep the people of Afghanistan, those parents and family members who've lost military members who died in Afghanistan, those who are still stuck, who are Americans wanting to get out of the country, all the people who are involved in any type of aid to care for them. The people in our country who are suffering through fire and flood and wind, all the service and COVID, there's a lot to pray for. So please keep all those people in mind. So until next week, take care and God bless.
God bless.